Welcome to a Miss Marple mystery. A candle that refuses to die, a village buried in snow, and a secret no prayer can hide. A young man found dead by holy light, and a truth burning quietly beneath Christmas cheer. But before we begin, where are you listening from tonight? Tell us below. Snow had fallen quietly through the night, laying a perfect white quilt over the village of Street Mary Mead. The next morning, a faint blue haze of frost drifted above the roofs, and the sound of church bells mixed with the crunch of boots on icy lanes. It was Christmas Eve when the vicar's wife arranged her famous charity bazaar in the parish hall, and everyone, from the colonel's widow to the grocer's daughter, had a part to play. Miss Marple, dressed in dove-grey wool and a sensible hat, walked up the lane with her little basket, her eyes as sharp as the frost itself. She never hurried, and yet she noticed everything: the hesitation of Mrs. Price's wave, the nervous glance of young Edward Copley near the post office, the too bright cheer in Mrs. Cranford's greeting. Christmas, she often thought, had a curious way of revealing character far more than Lent or Easter ever could. People became either too generous or too guarded, and human nature, she reflected, never changed. The parish hall looked beautiful that morning. Candles flickered in polished holders along the windowsills, and wreaths of holly and ivy framed the little stage. The scent of pine and cake filled the air. The centerpiece, crafted with loving care by the vicar's wife, was a large beeswax candle, shaped like an angel, placed in a crystal holder at the front of the stage. The Christmas candle, everyone called it. It had been used every year since 1894, lit during the carol service and then extinguished after midnight mass. Only this year it refused to go out. It began when Mrs. Templeton, who had been fussing over the raffle table, noticed the candle still burning at dawn the next morning. "It's impossible," she told the constable. "I was the last to leave, and I blew it out myself." The oddity quickly grew into gossip. The candle that wouldn't die. Some laughed. Others whispered that it was a sign. But when the caretaker arrived to open the hall later that day, the laughter stopped. There, at the base of the candle's crystal holder, lay the body of young Edward Copley, the organist's nephew. His face was pale as wax, his expression serene, as though he had fallen asleep beside the sacred light. But his hands were burned, and the candle's flame still glowed faintly beside him. The police arrived, puzzled but confident. "Some accident," declared Inspector Graves, brushing snow from his coat. "Poor chap must have come back late, slipped, caught fire maybe. We'll know more after the doctors had a look." Miss Marple, who had quietly entered with her knitting in hand, said nothing. She stood near the stage, studying the candle's faintly dripping wax, the scorch marks on the wooden floor, the position of Edward's right shoe turned slightly outward. It reminded her, strangely, of a footman she had once known who lied about polishing the silver. There was something just as out of place here, something polite but deceitful, and as she turned away, murmuring that she would pray for the boy's soul, Miss Marple's eyes fell upon a tiny, glistening object, half hidden under the tablecloth. Near the raffle prizes a broken gold cufflink engraved with the letter T. She tucked her handkerchief neatly over it before anyone noticed. Somewhere in this picture-perfect village, she thought, someone had used Christmas and candlelight to cover a very human sin. The following morning, a thin fog clung to the hedgerows as Street Mary Mead stirred under the uneasy weight of the night's news. Edward Copley, so young, so promising, dead, under mysterious circumstances in the parish hall. The Christmas bazaar, once the pride of the village calendar, now felt tainted, like fruit gone bad. Mrs. Price whispered in the grocer's shop that the candle had been cursed, while Colonel Melchett, overheard at the post office, dismissed it as damned foolish talk. Yet, even among the skeptics, something about the incident troubled them all. A candle that refused to die. A boy who had no reason to be there after midnight. It didn't fit the pattern of ordinary misfortune. Miss Marple sat quietly in her parlor, a cup of tea cooling beside her, as she sorted through her memories of the night before. She recalled how Edward had stood by the stage, his expression curiously tense, his eyes darting toward Mrs. Templeton more than once. And then there was that little matter of the broken cufflink now safely tucked inside a small china dish on her writing desk. "Tea," she murmured softly, tapping her chin. "Templeton? Thornton? Or perhaps something else entirely?" She knew better than to jump to conclusions. In her long acquaintance with human folly, she had seen far too many letters that stood for something other than a name. A knock at her door interrupted her thoughts. It was Inspector Graves, broad-shouldered, with a kind face that betrayed both intelligence and fatigue. "Morning, Miss Marple," he said, removing his hat. "Thought I'd best keep you informed. Doctor says the lad was poisoned arsenic, in all likelihood. Traces found in his tea flask, no sign of burns except where the candle wax dripped onto his skin afterward, so that settles that poisoning before the fire ever began." "Poor boy," Miss Marple said softly. "And yet, so neat a death for so young a man seems untidy, if you take my meaning." Graves gave a small, puzzled frown. "Untidy? In the moral sense, Inspector. Death that looks deliberate usually hides something else, vanity, fear, or guilt. But Edward, I think, wasn't a young man who frightened easily. You'd make a fine detective yourself, ma'am, if you weren't so busy knitting." "Oh, knitting," said Miss Marple with a gentle laugh, "is an excellent training for patience, and for noticing when one stitch doesn't quite belong." After the inspector left, Miss Marple decided a small walk was in order. The fog had thinned, and faint sunlight glinted off the icicles along the churchyard fence. She encountered Mrs. Templeton, emerging from the greengrocer's, her face pale beneath her fur collar. "Terrible business, Jane," she said, clasping Miss Marple's arm. "Edward was always so polite, though a little distant. Not quite sociable, if you know what I mean. I can't think why anyone would wish him harm." "Oh, indeed," Miss Marple replied mildly. "And yet, one hears he was in rather frequent conversation with you during rehearsals for the carol service." Mrs. Templeton stiffened slightly. "Only about the hymn arrangements. You know how young men are full of opinions about tempo and tone. Such nonsense." Miss Marple's smile deepened almost imperceptibly. "Yes, indeed. Quite like young Peter Graham once was, before he ran off to Brighton with the organist's daughter." Mrs. Templeton flushed. "Really, Jane, you do have a memory for scandal." "Oh, only for patterns, dear," said Miss Marple kindly. "I do so hate untidy endings." That evening, back in her cottage, she set the broken cufflink beside her knitting basket and lit a small candle on the mantelpiece. Its flame wavered gently, then steadied. Watching it, she thought of the boy's pale face, the letter T, and Mrs. Templeton's nervous tone. Somewhere in those three small details lay a truth no one else had yet seen, and as the church bells tolled in the cold night air, Miss Marple knew that the Christmas candle had not burned for faith, but for guilt. The following day brought a brittle kind of sunshine, the sort that seemed to make the frost glitter like broken glass along the hedgerows. Street Merry Mead went about its business with a curious blend of reverence and curiosity. People lowered their voices in the street, yet their eyes shone with a hunger for detail. In the post office, Mrs. Price declared she'd dreamt of a candle that wept blood. At the grocer's, Colonel Melchett muttered that the young were always dabbling in nonsense they didn't understand. Through all of it, Miss Marple remained quietly observant, never contradicting, never agreeing, merely listening, as she always did, to the way people revealed far more than they intended. By afternoon, the police had begun questioning everyone who had attended the bazaar. Inspector Graves, though polite, had little patience for village theatrics. His interviews were brisk, methodical, and as Miss Marple privately thought, completely blind to character. She watched from her corner in the parish hall as he questioned Mrs. Templeton once more. The lady was composed but not comfortable. Her gloved hands fidgeted, and her answers, while polite, carried the smooth rhythm of something rehearsed. "Edward was a nice boy," she said. "Sensitive, always worrying about appearances. He'd been unsettled lately, that's all. You know how young men can be too many ideas about their future." Graves nodded, writing something in his notebook. "Any idea what he was doing here after hours?" "I haven't the faintest. Perhaps he left something behind. A book, or his music sheets." The inspector shut his notebook with a small snap. "That'll do for now, Mrs. Templeton." Miss Marple watched her leave, then quietly approached. "Such a tragedy, Inspector," she said softly, her voice carrying the mild sympathy of an elderly neighbor. "Did she mention her husband?" Graves frowned slightly. "Mr. Templeton?" "Only that he was in London for business that night." "Why?" "Oh, no reason. No reason at all," Miss Marple murmured, though her eyes twinkled faintly. "Only I do so remember how Mr. Templeton dislikes London at Christmas time. He told me once that he couldn't abide the cold pavements and noise. Quite peculiar for a man who owns 3 shops in Knightsbridge." Graves looked up sharply, then sighed. "You think he's involved?" "My dear Inspector, I think everyone is involved, only most of them don't know how." That evening, Miss Marple received an unexpected visitor, Mrs. Cranford, the vicar's wife, her cheeks flushed with gossip and nerves. "Jane, I simply must tell you Mrs. Templeton has taken to her bed. Nerves, they say, but her maid told me she's had visitors twice today. Once a man in a dark overcoat, and later someone who left through the back gate. Very odd, don't you think?" Miss Marple poured her guest a cup of tea. "Quite odd," she agreed mildly, "though not entirely surprising. Guilt, my dear Mrs. Cranford, attracts company, though seldom the kind one would wish." After Mrs. Cranford left, Miss Marple sat by the window, her knitting idle in her lap. The candle on her mantel burned steadily, casting long, gentle shadows. She thought of Edward Copley again, his shy glances toward Mrs. Templeton, his anxious hands on the organ keys, the quiet pride with which he'd spoken of a song he'd composed himself. He had been working on something for the service, a new carol, he'd said, dedicated to someone special. The sheet music, she remembered, had been missing from his satchel when they found him. The next morning, she visited the church under pretense of bringing flowers. The organ loomed in the dim light, its keys glinting faintly. She ran a finger along the edge of the music stand, and there, folded neatly beneath a hymnal, was a single page of Edward's handwriting. The melody was unfinished, the final line abruptly cut off, but at the top he had written 2 words in careful script. "For tea, my light, that never fades." Miss Marple folded the paper gently. Outside, the bells tolled noon, and she thought of the candle that refused to die, of a young man's devotion, and of a woman who feared both exposure and love. Somewhere behind all of it, she sensed another hand, a colder, more calculating one that had struck under the guise of passion, and she knew, with quiet certainty, that the truth was beginning to burn. The churchyard was hushed beneath its winter blanket as Miss Marple left the vestry, the folded sheet of music tucked securely inside her handbag. The air was crisp, the sky faintly silver, and the sound of her footsteps mingled with the distant toll of the clock tower. There was a calmness about the village, now a deceptive one, she thought, like snow hiding rot beneath its surface. For all the piety of Christmas, people's hearts were far less pure than they pretended, and love, when thwarted or exposed, could be the cruelest sin of all. That afternoon, she paid a call to the Templeton house under the pretext of delivering a jar of her famous quince jelly. Mrs. Templeton, though pale, received her with the manners of one raised to maintain composure under scrutiny. The sitting room smelled faintly of lavender and smoke, with the remains of a half-burned log crackling on the hearth. On a small table near the window lay a man's gloves and an ashtray bearing the faint scent of a cigar. An expensive one. Miss Marple's eyes flickered to it, then back to her hostess. "How very kind of you, Jane." Mrs. Templeton said with brittle cheer. "You must forgive me. I've been quite out of sorts since the tragedy. It's dreadful, simply dreadful." "Of course, my dear," Miss Marple said softly, setting down the jar. "We all feel it most deeply, especially when the young are involved. Such promise, such wasted kindness." Mrs. Templeton's teacup rattled faintly against its saucer. Yes, he was. Kind. Too impressionable, perhaps, and too fond of certain people's opinions. Miss Marple's eyes remained serene. "It's a dangerous thing, being fond of the wrong opinion. I recall a curate once who mistook admiration for affection and found himself writing verses to a married lady. Very awkward when her husband read them aloud at the church fete." Mrs. Templeton gave a brittle laugh that dissolved into silence. "Jane, you've always had such dreadful stories." "Life provides them," Miss Marple replied mildly, "and it does so without asking whether one wishes to hear them." A moment passed. Outside, a robin flitted against the frosted glass. Miss Marple rose to leave, offering a kindly smile. But just as she turned, her eye caught something curious, a brass candlestick on the mantel, identical to the one used in the parish hall during the bazaar. Only this one bore a faint scorch mark near the base, as though once exposed to flame. "How charming," she said lightly, brushing her glove against it. "So similar to the ones at the church, aren't they?" Mrs. Templeton froze. "I wouldn't know," she said too quickly. "My husband, he purchased it years ago." Miss Marple inclined her head gently. "Of course." When she stepped back into the frosty air, she paused at the gate, taking in a long, slow breath. She had not missed the tremor in Mrs. Templeton's hand, nor the way her eyes darted toward the mantelpiece as though expecting it to reveal something. The candlestick had told its own story, and Miss Marple, who had learned long ago that objects often spoke more honestly than people, began to suspect that Edward's death had been less about love and more about concealment. That evening, she invited Inspector Graves for tea. He arrived, reluctant but curious, and was greeted with scones, cream, and the gentle certainty of Miss Marple's tone. "Inspector," she said, pouring his tea, "I wouldn't wish to interfere, but it might interest you to know that Mrs. Templeton possesses one of the parish candlesticks, and that it shows signs of use inconsistent with her account." Graves frowned. "You think she took it from the hall?" "Oh no," Miss Marple said, her knitting needles clicking softly. "I think someone returned it there after using it for a very different purpose. One doesn't need matches to relight a candle if one already knows it will not go out." He stared at her. "You mean?" Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Not yet, Inspector, but soon." And as the candle on her own mantel flickered in the quiet room, she glanced once more at the folded sheet of music beside her. "For tea, my light that never fades." In that single line, she saw the motive, the misdirection, and the heart of the lie. Someone had kindled a flame of devotion and then used it to destroy. The following morning dawned dim and heavy, with mist curling low over the meadows and the sound of distant church bells muffled through the fog. Miss Marple sat at her breakfast table, gazing absently at the steam rising from her teacup. Her thoughts, however, were not on breakfast, but on the strange symmetry of human nature, how easily guilt disguised itself as grief, and how the smallest vanity could turn into motive for murder. She could almost hear her late nephew Raymond's teasing voice. "Aunt Jane, you see murder in every misplaced glove." And yet, she mused, people often misplaced far more than gloves. They misplaced conscience, affection, truth. The knock at her door came gently, followed by the sound of Mrs. Cranford's anxious whisper. "Jane, have you heard? There's been a burglary at the Templetons' house. Of all places. The silver's gone, they say, and Mr. Templeton only just returned from London this morning." Miss Marple's brows lifted slightly. "Oh dear," she said, rising. "How very inconvenient for both the thief and the household." She took her shawl from the peg and followed Mrs. Cranford up the lane, her steps brisk despite the frost. At the Templeton house, Inspector Graves stood on the doorstep, his notebook open. He nodded when he saw her. "Morning, Miss Marple. You seem to arrive wherever I turn these days." "I find tea and trouble often travel together, Inspector," she said mildly. "Was much taken?" "Only the silver, it seems." And oddly enough, a small wooden box from the writing desk, Mrs. Templeton, claims it held nothing of value. But the lock was forced clean open. Miss Marple's eyes lingered on the front window, where frost patterns curled like frozen vines. "Strange, isn't it?" she said softly, "how theft so often arrives to tidy up what murder leaves behind." Graves frowned. "Meaning?" "Meaning," she murmured, "that someone is removing more than silver." Mrs. Templeton appeared in the doorway then, her complexion wan, her hair perfectly arranged yet trembling slightly at the temples. "I told you, Inspector, the thief must have known where to look. That box, it was my husband's old keepsake." "Nothing more." "Indeed," Miss Marple said gently. "And yet, you looked rather pale for something so trivial. Would you mind terribly, my dear, if I asked whether your husband's trip to London was successful?" Mrs. Templeton hesitated, her eyes darting toward the staircase. He hasn't said much about it. He's resting now." A deep voice interrupted from the landing above. "Not resting, my dear, listening." Mr. Templeton descended the stairs slowly, his heavy coat still dusted with travel grime. His eyes were sharp, assessing, his smile thin. "Miss Marple, isn't it? Always a pleasure to see one of Street Mary Mead's saints out in the field." "Merely an old woman who dislikes loose ends," Miss Marple replied pleasantly. "Then I fear you'll be very busy here," he said. "The world is full of them." He offered a polite nod, yet Miss Marple sensed the undercurrent beneath his civility, the faintest tremor of control slipping. There was something in his gaze when he looked toward his wife, a tension too deliberate to be purely marital. Later, when she walked home through the fading mist, Miss Marple's mind replayed the encounter with quiet precision. A burglary that left no signs of entry, a missing box, a husband too calm, too certain, and above all, that identical candlestick, burnished brass, scorched at the base. By evening, she had decided upon a small experiment. In her parlor, she set 2 candles side by side, one beeswax, one ordinary, and watched their flames dance in the dim light. Within moments, the ordinary candle guttered in a draught. The other, however, burned with a stubborn, steady glow. Even when she gently cupped her hand to extinguish it, the air smelled faintly of something metallic, unpleasantly sweet. She smiled faintly to herself. When Inspector Graves called the next morning, she greeted him with tea and quiet triumph. "You'll find your murderer, Inspector," she said. "Not in the heart of jealousy, but in the habit of control. Some people cannot bear even a candle to die without their permission." And as she spoke, the fog outside began to lift slowly, like the first veil of deceit giving way to the truth beneath. Inspector Graves sat in Miss Marple's parlor, his hat resting on his knee and his brow furrowed in weary frustration. The morning sunlight slanted through lace curtains, striking the polished silver teapot between them. Miss Marple poured his cup with unhurried grace, as though nothing in the world were more ordinary than discussing poison, burglary, and deceit over breakfast. "You see, Miss Marple," he said finally, "it doesn't fit. If Edward Copley was poisoned, and if the burglary followed, we're looking at 2 separate hands or someone clever enough to make it appear that way. I've questioned the servants, the Templetons, even the vicar's wife. No one saw anything suspicious that night." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Oh, my dear Inspector, everyone saw something suspicious. They simply failed to realize it." Graves looked puzzled. "Meaning?" She leaned forward slightly, her eyes bright beneath her soft grey curls, "Meaning that truth rarely hides it, merely sits where no one expects to find it. Tell me, Inspector, did you happen to notice the wax on Edward's sleeve?" He blinked. "The wax? Doctor said it was likely from the candle." "Indeed. But the candle burned pure beeswax. The stain on his sleeve, however, was paraffin, quite a different matter, which suggests he was near a second flame, one not part of the church service. Graves frowned, scribbling a note. Then he met someone elsewhere, perhaps at the Templetons. Perhaps, said Miss Marple softly, but one mustn't be hasty. You see, I visited their house yesterday, and there was a brass candlestick on the mantel, scorched, yet recently polished. Mrs. Templeton claimed it was her husband's purchase, though she looked as though she might faint when I touched it. Are you implying she? No, Inspector, Miss Marple interrupted gently. I never imply, I observe. And I observed that her husband's cigar ashtray was placed beside the same candlestick. One could imagine, quite easily, that a man returning late from London might light a candle to confront an inconvenient truth. Graves stared at her, the color draining slightly from his face. You think Templeton killed the boy? Miss Marple didn't answer at once. She turned toward the window, watching a pair of sparrows squabble on the frosty sill. I think, she said slowly, that Edward loved Mrs. Templeton, and that she, being foolish rather than wicked, did not discourage him. Her husband is a man accustomed to control his business, his household, and most certainly his wife. When he learned of the boy's devotion, it would not have been rage that moved him, but something colder. He would plan. He would use Edward's own trust against him. Graves' pen stilled. And the candle that wouldn't die? A perfect symbol, Miss Marple murmured. Edward believed it burned for love. Mr. Templeton made certain it burned for death. He replaced the beeswax with a treated wick soaked in paraffin oil. It would resist extinguishing, long enough to create a story of mystery while masking the true cause of death. When Edward collapsed, Templeton placed him near the candle to complete the illusion of accident. A convenient touch of poetry, don't you think? The inspector exhaled slowly, astonished. Good Lord, but the burglary? To retrieve the poisoned vial, of course, and perhaps a note, something Edward might have written to Mrs. Templeton. Guilt leaves traces, Inspector, even in paper form. Graves rose, his voice low but decisive. That's enough for me. I'll have him in custody before nightfall. Miss Marple smiled kindly. Do be gentle. He will bluster, of course, but men like that always do. It's pride that kills them long before the hangman ever does. As the door closed behind him, Miss Marple glanced toward her own mantel. The candle she had tested still stood there, its wick darkened now, its flame long gone, and yet a faint thread of smoke still curled upward just enough to prove that truth, once lit, never truly dies. By the time dusk crept across Street Mary Mead, the air had turned sharp with the promise of snow. The village lay still beneath a sky the color of pewter, its chimneys breathing thin ribbons of smoke. Miss Marple, sitting by her window, watched the last postman of the evening make his way down the lane, his boots crunching faintly on the frost. On the table beside her rested a small envelope delivered only an hour earlier, unmarked, and bearing a faint scent of cigar smoke. Inside, she had found a single line, written in a neat, masculine hand. You know too much, Miss Marple. Let it end here. It had not frightened her. Rather, it confirmed something she had already suspected, that her quiet deductions had stirred a mind accustomed to control. For such men, exposure was not merely danger, it was humiliation. She folded the note carefully into her sewing basket and lit the lamp. Moments later, Inspector Graves arrived, his face pale from the cold. He's gone, he said without preamble. Templeton. His wife swears he left after supper, said he needed air. But his car's still at the gate, and no one's seen him in the lanes. Miss Marple looked up from her teacup. I should think he's gone where all frightened men go to destroy what might convict him. The question, of course, is what that might be. Graves hesitated. You mean the poison? Or the letter Edward wrote, she murmured. The one he addressed to T, my light that never fades. It wasn't found among his things, was it? The inspector shook his head. No trace. Then it still exists, she said gently. And Templeton knows where. They found him near the parish hall just after 9. The snow had begun to fall again, soft and unhurried, as though the world wished to blanket the village in silence. Templeton stood within the darkened hall, his face caught in the trembling glow of the Christmas candle. Its flame burned steadily, unnaturally so, and his hands, clenched at his sides, glistened faintly with melted wax. "I suppose you've come to arrest me," he said without turning. Graves stepped forward. "It's over, Templeton. The evidence speaks plainly enough." Templeton gave a short, bitter laugh. "Evidence? What do you imagine you've found? Romance, jealousy, the petty sins of a provincial man. You know nothing. He was a fool. He thought himself in love with my wife. I merely corrected the imbalance." "By murdering him?" Graves barked. "By teaching him consequence," Templeton said coldly. "A lesson he'll remember if souls do." Miss Marple's voice, calm and almost sorrowful, broke the silence. "You see, that's just it. Souls remember kindness, not correction. And yet, you've left behind something even your pride cannot erase." Templeton turned, his face hard. "And what would that be, madam?" "The truth," she said simply. "In the note Edward wrote, which your wife hid in that wooden box you were so desperate to reclaim. You didn't steal it to protect her, Mr. Templeton. You stole it to keep the world from learning that she begged Edward to stop seeing her, that she had already chosen loyalty over sentiment. You killed a young man who had already let her go." For a moment, the man's composure wavered. The candle sputtered, casting grotesque shadows across his face. "You old devil," he whispered. "You can't possibly." But the rest of his protest dissolved into silence. Graves had stepped forward, the handcuffs glinting in the candlelight. Templeton did not resist. As they led him out, Miss Marple lingered behind. The candle still burned, its light unwavering, as though mocking the frailty of human deceit. She reached forward, gently pinched the wick, and this time the flame died at once. "Ah," she murmured softly to herself. "At last, a candle that knows when to go out." The following morning brought no cheer to Street Mary Mead. The snow had settled thickly overnight, wrapping the cottages and churchyard in a deceptive calm. But inside every house, whispers moved faster than the wind of Mr. Templeton's arrest, of Mrs. Templeton's fainting fit, of the strange candle that refused to die until Miss Marple herself had touched it. The village, that eternal engine of small curiosities, had found itself caught in the gravity of a true tragedy. Yet, amid all the chatter, one thing remained curiously unsaid, the reason why Miss Marple had not seemed surprised. Inspector Graves returned to her cottage that morning, his face pale but thoughtful. "It's all tied up now, Miss Marple," he said, settling into the chair by the hearth. "Templeton's confessed, at least in part. He admits to meeting the boy, dosing his tea, and staging the scene in the hall. Says he found out about Edward's feelings for his wife and meant to set him straight, as he put it. A jealous husband, nothing more." Miss Marple, knitting serenely, glanced up with mild amusement. "Oh dear, Inspector, nothing more is a phrase that rarely fits human behavior." Graves frowned. "You mean there's still something missing?" "Not missing," she replied, "merely hidden behind the wrong motive. Jealousy, yes, but not of affection. Mr. Templeton was not the sort of man to risk his reputation for the sake of wounded pride. He feared exposure of another kind, financial, perhaps. Edward Copley was clever, observant. He might have seen something in the Templetons' accounts that did not quite match." Graves rubbed his chin. "You think it wasn't just a love affair?" "I think," Miss Marple said softly, "it was a convenient illusion. A perfect story for a proud man to hide behind. One that everyone would accept without question, because jealousy is so comfortingly ordinary." Before Graves could reply, a sharp knock sounded at the door. "Mrs. Cranford burst in, flushed and trembling. "Jane! Inspector! You must come at once, it's Mrs. Templeton. She's disappeared." The three hurried to the Templeton home, where the front door hung ajar and a faint smell of paraffin lingered in the hall. The house was in disarray, drawers half open, the carpet disturbed, and on the writing desk, a small bottle labeled arsenic lay uncorked beside a folded sheet of paper. Graves picked it up, frowning. "A note. Says she couldn't live with the shame." Miss Marple's eyes swept the room. "And yet," she murmured, "her gloves are gone, her cloak missing, and that window latch is open from within. I should think she had no intention of dying here." Outside, faint tracks led through the snow toward the churchyard. The footprints were small, uncertain, yet purposeful. Miss Marple followed them in silence, her breath steady despite the cold. The path ended near the church's north wall, beside the stone bench where Edward used to sit and practice his carols. There, half buried in snow, lay the missing note, the ink still wet, as though dropped in haste. "She wanted to be found," Miss Marple said quietly, "but not dead." Graves stared at her. "Then where is she?" Miss Marple's gaze shifted toward the rectory, where a thin plume of smoke rose from the chimney, where anyone with a bruised conscience seeks forgiveness near the vicar's hearth. And indeed, moments later, they found her there, trembling by the fire, her face pale as linen. "I couldn't let him take all the blame," she whispered. "He told me what he'd done, but it wasn't murder. Not at first. Edward found the falsified ledgers. My husband panicked. He begged me to distract the boy, to keep him quiet. But Edward refused. He said he'd expose everything after Christmas." Miss Marple knelt beside her, her voice soft as falling snow. "So your husband silenced him and used your candle as his mask. You lit it every year, didn't you? He knew the village would notice if it burned too long. You were meant to find him, to confirm the story." Mrs. Templeton began to sob quietly, her hands covering her face. Miss Marple rose, her expression unreadable. "Human nature, Inspector," she said at last. "Always dressing its sins in sentiment. Even murder, when clothed in love, thinks itself less cruel." As they led Mrs. Templeton away, the church bells began to chime the hour. Through the frosted window, Miss Marple caught sight of the church hall across the square, where a caretaker snuffed the last remaining candle of the season. This time, it went out on the first breath. That evening, the snow had turned to a thin drizzle, soft and persistent, tracing silver lines against the lamplight. The village was quieter now, subdued in that peculiar way English villages are after scandal, neither shocked nor grieving, but politely rearranging its understanding of events. In the vicarage, Mrs. Templeton slept under watch, while her husband awaited trial in a cold cell at Melchester. Yet, for Miss Marple, the matter was not quite finished. Something in the whole affair refused to settle neatly, like a thread left dangling from a well-sewn hem. She sat by her fire, the room scented faintly of beeswax and lavender polish. Her knitting lay untouched as her eyes rested on the folded page of Edward's unfinished carol, "For tea, my light that never fades." Such a tender line, she thought. For a boy clever enough to see deceit, but too kind to guard against it. She smoothed the paper and studied the handwriting again, her sharp eyes noting a faint smudge near the lower margin, as if a second hand had once touched it, nervously or with guilt. There was a knock. It was Inspector Graves again, this time without his coat, his manner softer than usual. "Miss Marple," he said, "I've come to thank you. The magistrate's satisfied with the confession. The Templeton accounts prove your suspicion embezzlement, clear as day. The lad must have stumbled onto it while preparing the parish finances. Without you, we might have never seen it." She gave a small smile. "It wasn't deduction, Inspector, only habit. One learns that most crimes begin not with hatred, but with something smaller, a bit of pride, a bit of fear. They grow like ivy if one lets them." He nodded slowly, yet his expression was uneasy. "Still, I can't help wondering why would Mrs. Templeton risk hiding the boy's note at all. She must have known we'd find it, eventually. Miss Marple's gaze drifted toward the mantel, where her own candle burned low. Because, my dear Inspector, she didn't wish to destroy him entirely. The note was her way of keeping Edward's name clean, while her husband twisted it for his own story. Guilt and love often share the same house, they just sleep in separate rooms. Graves gave a rueful laugh. You've a poet's way of putting things, Miss Marple. Not poetry, she corrected gently. Just observation. People are rarely as wicked as their acts suggest, or as innocent as they hope to appear. They sat in companionable silence for a while, the clock ticking softly between them. Then, quite suddenly, Miss Marple frowned. Tell me, Inspector, what became of the Christmas candle? Graves looked surprised. It's still at the parish hall, I think. Why? Because, she said slowly, I never told anyone how easily it went out when I tried. Yet the villagers still speak as though it burns by some curse, which means someone relit it after the arrest. Graves straightened, startled. You think someone else was in the hall? I think, said Miss Marple, her voice low, that Edward Copley was not quite as alone that night as we believed. The second flame, the paraffin wax, remember? It was not Templeton's doing alone. Someone helped prepare that scene, and the same someone has tried, even now, to keep the story alive. She rose, her expression grave. Evil rarely ends with a confession, Inspector. It lingers like smoke from a snuffed candle. We must find who relit it. Outside, the drizzle thickened into mist, and the faint tolling of the church bell echoed across the square. As Miss Marple reached for her coat, the candle on her mantel guttered once, then flared briefly before dying. She watched the smoke curl upward, her eyes narrowing. Yes, she whispered, almost to herself. Someone else was watching that night. The next morning brought a damp chill that clung to the air, heavy with fog that blurred the cottages into pale silhouettes. Miss Marple, already awake before sunrise, sat at her table with a notebook open before her. The candle had burned low in the night, leaving a small ring of soot upon the glass holder. She regarded it thoughtfully, her eyes distant yet alert. Somewhere in this small village, someone had relit that cursed candle, someone who wanted the legend to live, to preserve the illusion that the crime had ended in tidy fashion. But evil, she knew, never liked neat endings. It preferred loose threads to pull. When Inspector Graves returned just after breakfast, his boots still muddy from the lane, he found her already dressed to go out. You were right again, he said grimly, holding up a slip of paper. The caretaker swears he locked the hall last night, yet the door was open this morning, and the candle burned down to the holder. Someone's playing games, and I don't like it. Miss Marple smiled faintly. Nor do I, Inspector. But games of this sort are always played for a reason. The murderer has been caught, but perhaps not the mind behind the curtain. Graves blinked. You mean an accomplice? Not in the act, perhaps, she replied softly, but in the thought. You see, I have wondered all along how Edward came to know of the Templetons' accounts. A young man like that would have no reason to study ledgers unless he were asked to help with them. And that, I think, was done by someone who wanted to expose Mr. Templeton, but not publicly. The inspector's expression darkened. The vicar's clerk, you mean? Or someone on the parish committee, closer to home? Miss Marple said, stepping into the fog-dimmed lane. Someone who knew both Edward's affection and Mr. Templeton's temper and wished to see one destroy the other. They walked together toward the churchyard, where the snow had thinned to wet slush. The air smelled faintly of smoke and damp stone. Near the gate stood Mrs. Price, bundled in a shawl, her face pink with cold and curiosity. Oh, Miss Marple, you've heard, I suppose? They say the candle burns itself out only when the guilty have confessed. A sign from above, if you ask me. Or from below, Miss Marple murmured. Tell me, Mrs. Price, you were helping at the hall last evening, were you not? Mrs. Price looked startled. Why, Yes, just tidying a few things after tea. Nothing odd about that. And you had a key, of course, Miss Marple said gently. The woman hesitated, her gloved hands tightening around her basket. Well, yes. The vicar's wife lent it to me. I returned it this morning. Returned it, Miss Marple repeated. Then you were there after dark. You must have seen the candle relit. Mrs. Price's mouth opened, then closed again. I only meant to tidy the flowers. The wax had dripped, and I thought it looked untidy. I didn't mean, Miss Marple finished for her, to keep the lie alive. But you did, Mrs. Price. You relit the candle because you wanted the village to keep talking. You enjoy such things, don't you? The stories, the whispers, the sense that Street Mary Mead hides secrets only you know. It's a small power, but power nonetheless. The woman's eyes widened, guilt and fear mingling like frost on glass. It was only a bit of wax and a match, she said weakly. I thought it made it poetic. Miss Marple smiled kindly. My dear, murder rarely needs poetry. It finds its own verse. When Mrs. Price fled down the lane, Miss Marple turned to the inspector. There's your answer, Inspector. Not an accomplice to murder, merely to mischief, the kind that feeds on tragedy until it becomes a comfort. Every village has one. Graves exhaled, relieved yet subdued. So it's finished, then. Miss Marple looked toward the churchyard, where the last wisp of smoke from the Christmas candle curled into the mist. Finished? She said softly. Perhaps, but the memory will burn a little longer, just as people do when they've seen too much light and not enough mercy.